Suicide of the West. An essay on the meaning and destiny of liberalism. James Burnham. Chapter 7, A Critical Note in Passing.
So that the complete syndrome may be freshly and simultaneously before us, I shall now make a summary list, though this will oversimplify, of the 19 liberal ideas and beliefs that were discussed in chapters 3 to 5. But in order to know what a thing is, we must understand what it is not. To clarify the liberal beliefs still further and to help, perhaps, to objectify our estimate of them, I shall draw up a list of 19 corresponding contrary beliefs, also stated summarily, and printed in a parallel column. In each case more than one contrary belief, in fact an infinite number of contraries, are logically conceivable, but since our positive interest is merely to throw more light on the meaning of liberalism, I have given only one of the possible contraries, as it happened to occur to me in first writing the list down.
Elements comprising the doctrinal dimension of the liberal syndrome.
One possible set of contrasting non-liberal elements.
L1. Human nature is changing and plastic, with an indefinite potential for progressive development, and no innate obstacles to the realization of the good society of peace, justice, freedom, and well-being.
X1. Human nature exhibits constant as well as changing attributes. It is at least partially defective or corrupt intrinsically, and thus limited in its potential for progressive development, in particular, incapable of realizing the good society of peace, justice, freedom, and well-being.
L2. Human beings are basically rational, reason and science are the only proper means for discovering truth and are the sole standard of truth, to which authority, custom, intuition, revelation, etc., must give way.
X2. Human beings are moved by sentiment, passion, intuition and other non-rational impulses at least as much as by reason. Any view of man, history and society that neglects the non-rational impulses and their embodiment in custom, prejudice, tradition and authority, or that conceives of a social order in which the non-rational impulses and their embodiments are wholly subject to abstract reason, is an illusion.
L3. The obstacles to progress and the achievement of the good society are ignorance and faulty social institutions.
X3. Besides ignorance and faulty social institutions, there are many other obstacles to progress and the achievement of the good society, some rooted in the biological, psychological, moral and spiritual nature of man, some in the difficulties of the terrestrial environment, others in the intransigence of nature, still others derived from man's loneliness in the material universe.
L4. Because of the extrinsic and remediable nature of the obstacles, it follows that there are solutions to every social problem and that progress and the good society can be achieved. Historical optimism is justified.
X4. Since there are intrinsic and permanent as well as extrinsic and remediable obstacles, the good society of universal peace, justice, freedom and well-being cannot be achieved, and there are no solutions to most of the primary social problems, which are, in truth, not so much problems as permanent conditions of human existence. Plans based on the goal of realizing the ideal society or solving the primary problems are likely to be dangerous as well as utopian, and to lessen rather than increase the probability of bringing about the moderate improvement and partial solutions that are in reality possible.
L5. The fact that an institution, belief or mode of conduct has existed for a long time does not create any presumption in favor of continuing it.
X5. Although traditional institutions, beliefs and modes of conduct can get so out of line with real conditions as to become intolerable handicaps to human well-being, there is a certain presumption in their favor as part of the essential fabric of society, a strong presumption against changing them both much and quickly.
L6. In order to get rid of ignorance, it is necessary and sufficient that there should be ample, universal education based on reason and science.
X6. There is no indication from experience that universal education based on reason and science, even if it were possible, which it is not, can actually eliminate or even much reduce the kinds of ignorance that bear on individual and social conduct.
L7. The bad institutions can be got rid of by democratic political, economic and social reforms.
X7. There is no indication from experience that all bad institutions can be got rid of by democratic or any other kind of reform. If some bad institutions are eliminated, some of the institutions remaining, or some that replace them, will be bad or will become bad.
L8. It is society, through its bad institutions and its failure to eliminate ignorance, that is responsible for social evils. Our attitude toward those who embody these evils, of crime, delinquency, war, hunger, unemployment, communism, urban blight, should be not retributive but rather the permissive, rehabilitating, education approach of social service, and our main concern should be the elimination of the social conditions that are the source of the evils.
X8. There are biological, psychological and moral as well as social causes of the major evils of society. A program of social reform combined with a merely permissive, educational and reformist approach to those who embody the evils not only has no prospect of curing the evils, which is in any event impossible, but in practice often fosters rather than mitigates them, and fails to protect the healthier sectors of society from victimization.
L9. Education must be thought of as a universal dialogue in which all teachers and students above elementary levels may express their opinions with complete academic freedom.
X9. Unrestricted academic freedom expresses the loosening of an indispensable social cohesion and the decay of standards, and permits or promotes the erosion of the social order. Academic discourse should recognize, and if necessary be required to recognize, the limits implicit in the consensus concerning goals, values and procedures that is integral to the society in question.
L10. Politics must also be thought of as a universal dialogue in which all persons may express their opinions, whatever they may be, with complete freedom.
X10. Unrestricted free speech in relation to political matters, most obviously when extended to those who reject the basic premises of the given society and utilize freedom of speech as a device for attacking the society's foundations, expresses, like unrestricted academic freedom, the loosening of social cohesion and the decay of standards, and condones the erosion of the social order.
L11. Since we cannot be sure what the objective truth is, if there is any such thing, we must grant every man the right to hold and express his own opinion, whatever it may be, and, for practical purposes as we go along, be content to abide by the democratic decision of the majority.
X11. Whether or not there is any truth that is both objective and capable of being known to be so, no society can preserve constitutional government or even prevent dissolution unless in practice it holds certain truths to be, if not literally self-evident, then at any rate unalterable for it, and not subject to the changing will of the popular majority or of any other human sovereign.
L12. Government should rest as directly as possible on the will of the people, with each adult human being counting as one and one only, irrespective of sex, color, race, religion, ancestry, property or education.
X12. A number of principles have been appealed to as the legitimate basis of government, and most of these have been associated in the course of time with bad, indifferent and moderately good government. Government resting on unqualified universal franchise, especially where the electorate includes sizable proportions of uneducated or propertyless persons, or cohesive subgroups, tends to degenerate into semi-anarchy or into forms of despotism, Caesarism, Bonapartism, that manipulate the democratic formula for anti-democratic ends.
L13. Since there are no differences among human beings considered in their political capacity as the foundation of legitimate, that is democratic, government, the ideal state will include all human beings, and the ideal government is world government. Meanwhile, short of the ideal, we should support and strengthen the United Nations, the World Court and other partial steps toward an international political order and world government, as these become successively possible in practice.
X13. In their existential reality, human beings differ so widely that their natural and prudent political ordering is into units more limited and varied than a world state. A world state having no roots in human memory, feeling and custom, would inevitably be abstract and arbitrary, thus despotic, in the foreseeable future, if it could conceivably be brought into being. Though modern conditions make desirable more international cooperation than in the past, we should be cautious in relation to internationalizing institutions, especially when these usurp functions heretofore performed by more parochial bodies.
L14. In social, economic and cultural as well as political affairs, men are of right equal. Social reform should be designed to correct existing inequalities and to equalize the conditions of nurture, schooling, residence, employment, recreation, and income that produce them.
X14. It is neither possible nor desirable to eliminate all inequalities among human beings. Although it is charitable and prudent to take reasonable measures to temper the extremes of inequality, the obsessive attempt to eliminate inequalities by social reforms and sanctions provokes bitterness and disorder, and can at most only substitute new inequalities for the old.
L15. Social hierarchies and distinctions among human beings are bad and should be eliminated, especially those distinctions based on custom, tradition, prejudice, superstition, and other non-rational sources, such as race, color, ancestry, property, particularly landed and inherited property, and religion.
X15. It is impossible and undesirable to eliminate hierarchies and distinctions among human beings. A large number of distinctions and groupings, rational and non-rational, contributes to the variety and richness of civilization, and should be welcomed, except where some gross and remediable cruelty or inequity is involved.
L16. Subgroups of humanity defined by color, race, sex, or other physical or physiological attributes do not differ in civilizing potential.
X16. Whether or not subgroups of humanity defined by physical or physiological attributes differ congenitally and innately in civilizing potential, they do differ in their actual civilizing ability at the present time and are likely to continue so to differ for as long in the future as is of practical concern.
L17. The goal of political and social life is secular, to increase the material and functional well-being of humanity.
X17. Among the goals of political and social life, well-being is subordinate to survival, and all secular goals are in the last analysis subordinate to the ultimate moral or religious goal of the citizens composing the community.
L18. It is always preferable to settle disputes among groups, classes, and nations, as among individuals, by free discussion, negotiation, and compromise, not by conflict, coercion, or war.
X18. Disputes among groups, classes, and nations can and should be settled by free discussion, negotiation, and compromise when, but only when, the disputes range within some sort of common framework of shared ideas and interests. When the disputes arise out of a clash of basic interests and an opposition of root ideas, as is from time to time inevitably the case, then they cannot be settled by negotiation and compromise but must be resolved by power, coercion, and, sometimes, war.
L19. Government, representing the common good democratically determined, has the duty of guaranteeing that everyone should have enough food, shelter, clothing, and education, and security against unemployment, illness, and the problems of old age.
X19. Except in marginal and extreme cases, the duty of government is not to assure citizens food, shelter, clothing, and education, and security against the hazards of unemployment, illness, and old age, but to maintain conditions within which the citizens, severally and in association, are free to make their own arrangements as they see fit. I repeat that the second, X, list is presented only for the sake of the first, L, only to throw additional light on the meaning of the first, and not at all to argue any virtues the second list might be thought to possess, or to recommend it to the reader. I should, however, note that, besides the specific differences in content between each of the 19 beliefs in the L list and its opposite number in the X list, there is a difference in structure as well as content between the two sets of 19 taken in their entirety. The L list is the verbalization of a single, more or less systematic ideology, the ideology of modern liberalism. The X list, though it perhaps has a recognizably conservative cast, does not constitute an ideology, not any ideology at all. The 19X beliefs are related much more loosely to each other, both logically and psychologically, than the 19L beliefs. Thus the two sets are not true opposites of each other, though each individual pair consists of logical contraries. The two sets are two different kinds of thing, like a house and an apple. More generally, the alternatives to an ideology are not solely other ideologies. There is also the possibility of abandoning ideologies and ideological thinking altogether. A convinced liberal believes all of the 19L beliefs, or is at any rate logically committed to belief in all or nearly all of them. But the X list is not so all or nothing. Both logically and psychologically, it is not only possible but frequently the case that a person should believe 6 or 8 of the X beliefs and doubt or reject the rest. For several, he might substitute the corresponding L beliefs, and for others, alternate beliefs that I have not stated. This book is in no way concerned to refute liberalism. The question of the truth or falsity of an ideology is in any case of minor importance. Human beings believe an ideology, as a rule, not because they are convinced rationally that it is true but because it satisfies psychological and social needs and serves, or seems to serve, individual or group interests. Still, I do not want to hide my own conviction, nor could I, if I would, that the 19 constituent beliefs in the liberal list are, so far as they can be judged in terms of truth and falsity, false on the available evidence, and that, though they may not be internally inconsistent, they are pragmatically contradictory in the sense that they lead in practice, and necessarily lead, to results that violate their own premises and intentions. Though I shall not attempt to offer a sufficient case for this summary judgment, I will motivate it briefly with respect to 2 or 3 of the crucial liberal beliefs, not so much in order to prove those beliefs false as to suggest that they are at any rate not self-evidently true. Let us consider, then, the liberal theory of human nature. According to liberal doctrine, human beings are not innately corrupt or defective or subject to essential limitations in their psychological and social dimensions. Obviously there are certain physical limitations to which human beings are subject, though these, and their possible consequences for individual conduct and social life, are usually not stressed in discussion of the human potential by liberal ideologues. Human beings are capable of an unlimited, or at least an indefinitely great, advance toward the good life and the good society. There is nothing ineradicably evil in human nature or the human psyche. On the contrary, the primary motivation of human beings is, or can become, rational, so that once education gets rid of ignorance, prejudice, superstition and frustrating customs, human beings will conduct themselves reasonably and will thus be able to build a reasonable society of peace, freedom, justice and material well-being. At the height of the Victorian period, when the articulate part of the world was enjoying the century of approximate peace bestowed by the British Empire, the spreading fruits of the steam engine and the factory system, and the softening early effects of humanitarian and parliamentary triumphs, in that age of what seemed to most educated men, except for a few perverse poets and artists, an historical dawn if not quite yet full sunshine, this liberal portrait of human nature, inherited from the 18th century Enlightenment, was not altogether implausible even from a non-ideological perspective. Even then, some scrupulous observers were troubled when they recalled that, as understood by all the centuries of Christianity, the body of faith and belief under which the civilization of Europe and the Americas had taken form, and by all other of the great world religions, man is a creature by essence limited and bounded, his potential goodness corrupted by a portion of evil that by his own efforts cannot be overcome, fated to walk in the valley of the shadow of an alien material universe, under unreprievable sentence of death. Those who were inclined to dismiss religious doctrine as superstition might nevertheless have noted that it was borne out in full and terrible detail by the entire history of man, in every continent, climate and region of the earth, in every society at every stage of development from primitive tribe to mighty empire, constructed by whatever race, black, brown, yellow, red or white. Only those who know very little about the history of mankind can suppose that cruelty, crime or weakness, mass slaughter or mass corruption, are exceptions from the normal human rule. A doctrine of human nature that paints a picture of what man might be that is in direct contradiction to what he has always and everywhere been may be a comfort to the spirit, but is not to be taken very seriously as a scientific hypothesis. The fundamental law of every genuine science is the postulate that the pattern of what happens in the future will probably resemble that of what has been observed to happen in the past. Any belief requiring the assumption that the future will be radically different from the past is not only false on the evidence, it could not be otherwise, since the only evidence available to man is the observations he has made in the past, but non-scientific in kind, no matter how many invocations the believer makes to science and reason. If there was a Victorian moment that perhaps excused a brief optimism over the chance that the human future might be radically unlike the past, what can a reasonable man, once he frees himself from ideology, conclude from the record of our own era? The grimmest lessons of the past about the inherent limits and defects of human nature have been continuously confirmed by wars with tens of millions dead, by mass persecutions and tortures, deliberate starvation of innocents, wanton killings by tens of thousands, the ingenuities of science used to perfect methods of mass terror, new forms of enslavement, gigantic genocides, the wiping out of whole nations and peoples. True enough, the record of the present as of the past is not an unmixed black. The crimes and horrors are mingled with achievements, mercies and heroism. But in the face of what man has done and does, it is only an ideologue obsessed with his own abstractions who can continue to cling to the vision of an innately uncorrupt, rational and benignly plastic human nature possessed of an unlimited potential for realizing the good society. It is not merely the record of history that speaks in unmistakable refutation of the liberal doctrine of man. Ironically, because it is liberalism that has maintained so exaggerated a faith in science, almost all modern scientific studies of man's nature unite in giving evidence against the liberal view of man as a creature motivated, once ignorance is dispelled, by the rational search for peace, freedom and plenty. Every modern school of biology and psychology and most schools of sociology and anthropology conclude that men are driven chiefly by profound non-rational, often anti-rational, sentiments and impulses, whose character and very existence are not ordinarily understood by conscious reason. Many of these drives are aggressive, disruptive, and injurious to others and to society. Some of them, as seen by modern science, are destructive to the self, seeking pain, suffering, even death. And these negative impulses, if they are to be designated so, are no less integral to the human psyche than those positive impulses pointing toward the liberal ideals. The liberal assumes, and must assume, that men, given a knowledge of the problem and freedom to choose, will opt for peace, justice and plenty. But the facts do not bear him out either for individuals or for societies. Individuals choose, very often, trouble, pain, injury, for themselves and for others. Societies choose, as Egypt, Indonesia, Ghana and many another nation are choosing in our day as soon as they have the chance, guns instead of butter, empire instead of justice, despotic glory instead of democratic cooperation. Of course the liberal can always say, that is because they, individuals and societies, were not sufficiently educated and were too much handicapped by the bad institutions held over from the past. To that argument there can be no answer, because in making it he is speaking as an ideologue, and all evidence becomes irrelevant. It is also ironic that liberalism, so prevalent among modern intellectuals and so widely regarded as the truly creative outlook in modern society, has failed to attract any of the major creative writers of our century. Professor Lionel Trilling, who seldom deviates from the liberal line on specific political or social issues though he is mildly heterodox in theory, discussed this little remarked but surely significant fact in an article published in 1962 by the magazine Commentary. He pointed out that none of the major writers has been a liberal and that most of them have been anti-liberal, and that there is no great 20th century literary work infused with the liberal ideology as De Rerum Naturae, the Aeneid, the Divine Comedy, Don Quixote, Faust and War and Peace were infused with other ideologies. In the 20th century, Professor Trilling declares, there has been no literary figure of the very first rank, who, in his work, makes use of or gives credence to liberal or radical ideas. Many secondary writers and a substantial majority of critics have been and are liberals, but Henry James, Marcel Proust, Ezra Pound, William Butler Yeats, James Joyce, André Gide, Thomas Mann, T.S. Eliot, all of whom the liberals so much admire, so frequently imitate and so endlessly comment on, have all been, often explicitly and scornfully, anti-liberal. The findings of the modern scientific study of genetics seem to strike a multiple blow at the liberal conception of man and his prospects. The fixity of unit characteristics, their biological transmission through the genes according to mathematical laws of probability, and the non-inheritability of acquired characteristics combine to reinforce the non-liberal belief that human nature has a permanent substratum, that there are ineradicable differences among men not traceable to social circumstance, and that there are limits, often quite low, to what even the most perfect education could accomplish. Genetics certainly gives no support to any doctrine holding that education and social reform could transform man into a creature so radically different from what he has been as would be the case if he dropped his aggressive, destructive and other troublemaking traits. The conclusions to be drawn from genetics would, indeed, seem to be even more drastically counter to the liberal faith in secular progress. It seems to be generally agreed that under the conditions of modern life, the sectors of the human population with inferior genetic assets, inferior, that is, from an intellectual, moral and civilizing standpoint, are increasing, rather rapidly, relative to those with superior assets. Because the ideology of modern liberalism has become so powerful an influence in contemporary American thought and conduct, it is worth noting that the liberal doctrine of human nature is sharply at variance with the view that prevailed among the founding fathers of the Republic. At this critical point they parted company with the European Enlightenment, from which, in other respects, they drew so many of their opinions. Most of them believed, with John Adams, that human passions are insatiable, that self-interest, private avidity, ambition and avarice will exist in every state of society and under every form of government, and that reason, justice and equity never had weight enough on the face of the earth to govern the councils of men. Ignorance, liberal doctrine tells us, is in the last analysis the only obstacle to the good society, peaceful, free, just, prosperous and happy, and ignorance can be dispelled by a rational education accepting the axioms of academic freedom and free speech. Even the problem of reforming bad institutions is secondary to education, because once education overcomes ignorance, then men as defined by liberal ideology, will know what is wrong with the institutions, and will take steps to correct them. What do the facts show? The facts show plainly that there are many obstacles on the road to the good society that are at least as formidable as ignorance, obstacles, such as I have cited, innate to the human organism and psyche, obstacles planted in the physical nature around us, the accumulated weight of history that unavoidably presses on all of us. The facts, moreover, do not show any positive correlation between education and the good life, for society or even for the individual. Athens was the most educated society of the ancient world and in some respects of all time, and Athens fell as much from inner decay as from external foes. Germany has been the most literate, the most thoroughly educated nation of the 20th century, and Germany bred Hitler, Nazism and the gas chambers. The Russian drive for totalitarian world power becomes only better equipped and more threatening as the formerly illiterate Russians become more educated. The universities of India and the Arab world, and also of Europe and America, have bred more communists than have the backward villages. In the United States, all of our children go to school, but in many of our cities they are much worse behaved and more dangerous to society than their unschooled ancestors of a few generations ago. Modern Japan is a completely literate nation, but her literacy did not draw her back from the Marco Polo Bridge or Pearl Harbor. Lenin and his closest associates, Goebbels, Goering, Hess and Schacht if not Hitler himself, Klaus Fuchs and Alger Hiss, 10,000 traitors, 1 million suicides and tens of millions of neurotics, have all been highly educated men. After all, has not Satan always been known to be the most intelligent of created beings? And was it not by leading them to eat of the tree of knowledge that he drove Adam and Eve from paradise? There is still another difficulty in the liberal belief that the removal of ignorance, as the key obstacle, will bring the good society. Suppose we ask, how is ignorance to be overcome? By universal institutionalized schooling, presumably. This is the remedy that the liberals have always advocated, where they have not taken it for granted. By its own rules, liberalism cannot accept as the proper method for eliminating ignorance the sort of educating in traditions, conduct, folkways and uncritical beliefs that a child gets from home and family, or the religious educating done through the church. On the contrary, home, church and family are seen as likely sources of the errors, superstitions and prejudice that proper education must overcome. Now the fact is that we do have universal institutionalized education, or come close to having it, in the advanced nations. But this has not removed ignorance, especially about political, social and economic matters, and to whatever extent it may have done so in some countries, the removal of ignorance has not brought any notable advance toward the good society. The 19th century liberals overlooked, and the 20th century liberals declined to face, the fact that teaching everyone to read opens minds to propaganda and indoctrination at least as much as to truths, and on political and social matters it is propaganda and indoctrination rather than truth that universal education has most conspicuously nurtured. All modern dictators quickly establish universal education, just as they institute a really universal franchise, and rigorously carry it out, without discrimination on the basis of sex, religion, color or whatever, if it was not already in operation. And we have already noted that some of the least ignorant nations of our day have, or have had, the worst governmental regimes. Liberalism, we have found, is committed to a relativist theory of truth. Liberalism holds that there is no such thing as objective truth, or, if in some abstract sense there may be objective truth, that it is impossible for us to be sure that we know it. That theory is the ultimate justification for universal free speech and democracy. No man has the right to believe that his truth has any priority in the marketplace over any other man's. Indeed, his truth is in no way privileged even over the other man's error, for who can know, and know that he knows, which is which? Truth too, at least with respect to political, economic and social affairs, must accept the verdict of democracy's tribunal. Everyone should speak his piece, advocate his own truth, and then let the majority decide. Aristotle was the first of the many philosophers who have pointed out that a wholly relativist theory of truth cuts the ground from under its own feet, is self-refuting. As a relativist, I say that there is no way to be sure of the truth, and that therefore every man is entitled to his own opinion. But how do I know that it is true that there is no way to be sure of the truth? And how can I prove to you that every man is entitled to his own opinion if you deny this? By my own principle, may not your denial be just as true as my assertion? We are thus plunged into an unending series of mutual contradictions, with no way of reaching a conclusion. Suppose that you deny and reject the whole doctrine of liberalism. Then, by that doctrine itself, you are not only entitled to your opinion, but there is just as much chance that your opinion is true as that liberalism is true. The fact is that all human discussion, all communication among human beings, and thus every form of human society, must assume that not all opinions are true, that some of them are false, that there is an objective difference between truth and falsity, and that if you and I hold contrary views, then at least one of us is wrong. There may be a trace of sophistry in this Aristotelian critique, and some modern logicians believe they avoid the theoretical dilemma it poses by introducing the idea of logical types or levels. Even so, liberalism confronts an inescapable practical dilemma. Either liberalism must extend the freedoms to those who are not themselves liberals and even to those whose deliberate purpose is to destroy the liberal society, in effect, that is, must grant a free hand to its assassins, or liberalism must deny its own principles, restrict the freedoms, and practice discrimination. It is as if the rules of football provided no penalties against those who violated the rules, so that the referee would either have to permit a player, whose real purpose was to break up the game, to slug, kick, gouge and whatever else he felt like doing, or else would have to disregard the rules and throw the unfair player out. This practical dilemma has been driven home in our day by the growth of totalitarian movements operating within the structure of democratic and liberal society. It suggests a grave weakness in the liberal ideology, one that has troubled many liberals. Surely there would seem to be something fundamentally wrong with a doctrine that can survive in application only by violating its own principles. I plan to return to this dilemma, and some of its consequences, in another context. There are a number of other practical dilemmas that modern liberalism cannot avoid. Take, as one additional example, the meaning of the liberal declaration against social hierarchies, segregation, discrimination, against what sets one group of men apart from others. Certainly some sorts of discrimination are of a kind that seems cruel and unjust to almost everyone. But the trouble is that human beings, the human beings of the real world, are hierarchical and segregating and discriminating animals. There has never been a human society anywhere, at any time, from the most primitive tribe to the freest republic to the most civilized empire, in which there have not been segregations, discriminations and groupings, into young and old, male and female, warrior and peasant, slave and citizen, black and brown and white, believer and unbeliever, tall and short, rich and poor, egghead and blockhead. There is always apartheid. The South African word means merely apartness, in some degree, on some basis or other. Even in college there are clubs and fraternities, freshmen and seniors, athletes and brains, chess players and beer drinkers and aesthetes. Prison and concentration camp are no different from other forms of human society. The French writer David Rousset, who was for some years an inmate of Nazi concentration camps, wrote a brilliant study of what he called the concentrationary universe. Its main point is to record the existence within the camps of the same patterns of social division and discrimination that exist in the outside world, and his findings have been confirmed by many ex-inmates of the Soviet camps. Now the fact that social discriminations always exist does not justify this particular discrimination, whatever it may be. Perhaps we ought to get rid of this one, or at least try to mitigate its degree. But it shows that the attempt to get rid of all discriminations, all apartheid, is illusory. The undiscriminating effort to end all discrimination must necessarily fail. Either the old groupings remain, perhaps with new protective disguises, or they are replaced by new and different types of discrimination that may be worse than the old, party member and outsider, bureaucrat and plain citizen, college graduate and non-graduate, secret policeman and concentration camp candidate. The critical comments made in this section deal with what might be called formal elements of the liberal ideology. I have reviewed evidence, accessible to everyone from his own experience and reading, indicating that the liberal theories of human nature and social progress and the liberal belief that ignorance is the primary obstacle to the good society are false. And I have shown that the logic of the liberal doctrine of free speech and the liberal program to remove all social discrimination is self-refuting in practice. Other of the liberal beliefs can be analyzed along similar lines. For example, it can be shown, and has been shown by a number of writers, that the idea of the general will and popular sovereignty in the form required by liberal ideology is inconsistent in theory and impossible in practice. However, I shall close this parenthesis here, since a further elaboration of the formal critique is not relevant to the purposes of this book. It is of course possible to analyze the merits and demerits, or simply the meaning, of liberalism from quite different perspectives. Without reference to the truth or falsity of liberal beliefs, we might consider the psychology and sociology of liberals, liberalism as a moral code, liberalism as a political device, or the pragmatic consequences of widespread acceptance of the liberal ideology, and some of these considerations will be dealt with, one way or another, in chapters to come.